Maple Glen Estates had rules pages and pages of them, from grass height limits to the exact shade of taupe allowed on your mailbox. The neighborhood prided itself on order, but no rule in that 83-page manual ever warned residents about the true danger lurking behind the gates. Her name was Karen Whitmore. To outsiders, Karen was just a 60-something retiree who walked her poodle at 6 a.m. sharp. But to the people inside Maple Glen, she was a self-declared queen armed with bylaws and binoculars. She was the HOA president for the last 9 years, unchallenged, unquestioned, and as everyone soon learned, untouchable. Across the street, a newcomer had just moved in. Lindsay Myers, fire marshal, single mom, zero patience for nonsense. Lindsay had bought the house for her son, Cody, to have space and peace after losing her husband. What she didn't know was that she'd also bought a front row seat to one of the most absurd power struggles in HOA history. The first encounter happened on day 2. Lindsay's garage door had been left open while she unloaded groceries. 10 minutes, maybe less. Karen appeared like a specter. "You're violating Rule 7B. Garage doors must be shut when not in use." Lindsay, sweaty and holding a gallon of milk, looked at her for a beat too long. "I'm literally using it. Then finish using it, or I'll issue a fine." Most people would have backed down, but Lindsay wasn't most people. She gave Karen a smile with teeth in it. "You do that." And that was the moment it started. The Cold War. Over the next 3 weeks, Lindsay received 3 citations. 1 for wind chimes over 12 decibels, 1 for non-regulation trash bin placement, and 1 for allowing her son to skateboard in the driveway past 7 o'clock p.m. Each time, Lindsay laughed it off. Each time, Karen grew more irritated. Until one morning, Lindsay received a thick envelope from the HOA, a notice of probationary residency status, citing her for disruptive conduct and intimidation tactics. Her crime: offering to give a fire safety presentation at the HOA meeting. Karen, in her report, claimed Lindsay was undermining board authority and spreading fear with unverifiable fire statistics. But what Karen didn't know was this: Lindsay had already flagged a fire risk. Karen's house, specifically her overloaded electrical system, old panel, extension cords tangled like jungle vines, and stored chemicals in the basement no one should ever keep near heat. Lindsay had done a quiet walkthrough when responding to a small circuit overload complaint next door. What she saw behind Karen's house made her stomach twist. She submitted a formal fire hazard report to the HOA board. Karen suppressed it, claimed no external inspectors had the right to assess private property without HOA authorization. And once again, the board sided with her. But not all members were convinced. A junior board member, Tiffany, emailed Lindsay anonymously that night. "She's hiding something. She doesn't want the report public. And she's furious you're poking around." Lindsay knew how these things went. She'd seen it before. An overconfident homeowner refusing advice, and a house in flames weeks later. But this wasn't just any homeowner. This was Karen. And Karen wasn't just ignoring the danger. She was actively building the matchbook. Now here's where you need to pay attention. Because what happens next, you won't see it coming. This isn't a story about a house fire. It's about pride, power, and a moment that changes an entire neighborhood forever. And it all starts with a fire truck that gets turned away. 3 nights later, it started with a smell. Karen Whitmore woke up around 11 a.m. to what she would later describe as a faint barbecue stink. Only there was no barbecue, no cookout, no neighbors outside sipping beers and flipping burgers under string lights. There was only silence and the odd, creeping haze she noticed forming near the ceiling vent. She didn't panic. Karen, after all, had been HOA president longer than any of her 3 marriages had lasted. She wasn't about to be rattled by a little smoke. She figured the heating system was just dusty. Or maybe her neighbor's chimney was acting up. She got out of bed and shuffled down the hallway in her slippers, arms crossed, nightgown stiff with starch. By the time she reached the kitchen, the haze was thicker, and it wasn't drifting anymore. It was moving. It was billowing. Then she heard it. A sharp pop, followed by a low, rolling hiss like something angry had just been awakened beneath the floorboards. The cat, Sir Mewington, darted out from under the table like a furry lightning bolt, straight for the front door. Karen's eyes followed him. Then, something clicked. She had an old space heater in the basement, and last week, during one of her board executive storage sessions, she'd left it plugged in, next to a stack of old paint cans and a bag of expired fertilizer she never quite got round to throwing out. Still, she didn't call 911. Not yet. She opened the door to the basement and was immediately greeted with a rush of hot, acrid air. Her skin pulled tight. Her eyes burned. But more than anything, her pride screamed louder than the smoke alarms. She slammed the door shut. She would not be the woman who burned down her own home. Not after mocking her neighbors for years about their improper insulation and reckless use of candles. Not after publicly berating a family for letting their Christmas lights hang too long. No. Karen was going to fix this quietly. She picked up the landline and dialed the non-emergency fire services line. What she didn't know was that Lindsay Myers was on shift that night. The station received the call at 2:19 a.m. Possible electrical fire. Smoke in the residence, no flames visible. Lindsay was already halfway into her gear before the address came through. Maple Glen. Karen. Whitmore's house. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. 15 minutes later, Engine 7 rolled down the road into the neighborhood but stopped cold at the main gate. The code didn't work. The keypad flashed red. One of the newer firefighters, Devin, glanced at Lindsay. Isn't there usually a universal override? There was. Lindsay muttered. Karen had it removed last month. Why? Privacy concerns. Only the board and approved vendors were allowed through without individual homeowner clearance. And Karen, she hadn't approved the fire department. Lindsay hit the intercom at the gate and pressed the call button for Karen's house. No answer. Smoke, now fully visible, began to waft above the rooftops. Devin stepped back. Should we force it? Can't, Lindsay said. We don't have legal grounds unless a person's confirmed inside or we get homeowner consent. She hit the intercom again. This time, Karen answered, her voice raspy and sharp. Who is this? Karen, it's Fire Marshal Lindsay Myers. We need immediate access. There's active smoke coming from your home. Karen paused. Then, unbelievably, said, I'm handling it. You're not authorized. This is HOA property. There was a beat of stunned silence inside the fire truck. Lindsay leaned toward the mic. This is not a request. If you don't grant entry in the next 30 seconds, we have to wait until escalation protocols trigger. Karen snapped, if you break that gate, I will sue. Then the line went dead. The team sat there, engines idling, minutes passing. From behind the gate, through the rising smoke, they saw it, a soft, orange flicker in the basement window. And then a blast of heat. The fire had started for real, and Karen was standing between it and the only people who could stop it. The thing about fire is it doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if you're the HOA president or the queen of Maple Glen. It doesn't care how many citations you've handed out, or how many bird feeders you've banned. It just wants fuel. and Karen Whitmore's house was full of it. By the time the orange glow punched through her basement window, it was already too late. Inside her house, the smoke had thickened into choking waves. Her eyes watered, her lungs burned, and her false sense of control started to wither like the dry drapes in her living room. She ran outside, still barefoot, still clutching the landline like a badge of authority. And who was there waiting for her on the other side of the gate? Lindsay, standing beside the red and white fire engine. Helmet on, gloves on. Calm, focused. Karen stormed toward the keypad. Like a woman possessed, she punched in the override code. Access denied. The keypad blinked. She tried again. Access denied. Lindsay stepped forward. Karen, the fire is growing. You need to give us authorization. Now, I am, Karen screeched. I'm entering the code. You changed it last week, Lindsay said. You restricted it to board-only access. You need to give us the manual override. Karen stared, as if she just remembered, as if her own obsession with privacy and protocol had finally caught up to her. Her voice trembled. I don't remember the new code. Behind her, a low boom echoed from the basement. The windows shook. A puff of black smoke burst from the side vent like a dragon exhaling its first breath. Karen screamed. Inside, something was burning. Something important. Something expensive. She pounded on the gate. Just break it. Use the truck, push it open. Lindsay didn't flinch. You specifically filed a civil injunction last month. That prevents us from doing that unless there's confirmed life inside. My house is burning, Karen shrieked. Lindsay looked her dead in the eye. So let us in. Karen blinked. Then whispered the override. Lindsay repeated it into her radio. Seconds later, the gate creaked open, smoke crawling toward the road like it was trying to escape the chaos inside. The fire crew moved fast. Axes, hoses, orders shouted, boots pounding pavement. But Lindsay didn't move with them. She stood there, watching Karen, watching the woman who'd fined her 3 times in a single week for visual disorder. Because her recycling bin had a sticker on it, Karen didn't say thank you, didn't apologize, just stared at the growing flames like she could will them back into the walls. Then she said something Lindsay didn't expect. This is your fault. Lindsay turned her head slowly. Excuse me, if you hadn't escalated things, if you hadn't embarrassed me at the board meeting, you're the reason this happened. You poisoned the neighborhood against me. Lindsay took a step closer. I warned you. I told you your house was a fire hazard. You ignored it. You buried my report. Karen's jaw clenched. You think you're so righteous. Lindsay didn't answer. She just walked past her and toward the blaze. At 3:03 a.m., neighbors began waking up. Some from the noise, some from the smell, some from the dull, rolling thud that came when the fire reached the storage closet, full of Karen's antique books, flammable, dry, stacked to the ceiling. By 3:15, half the block was outside in their robes and pajamas, holding their phones. Recording. Streaming. Whispers turned into commentary. Is that Karen's place? She wouldn't let the firefighters in. Are you kidding me? Wait, is that Lindsay Myers in the helmet? Somewhere in the crowd, a teenager named Toby uploaded the first video to TikTok. In it, Karen is yelling at the firefighters. Lindsay is calm, silent. Flames are shooting out behind them like a scene from an action movie. The caption, when Hoakaren blocks the fire depth, then watches her basement explode. It had 28,000 views in under an hour. By the time the sun broke through the smoky skies over Maple Glen Estates, Karen's house was reduced to a blackened, smoking shell. The fire was officially declared contained at 4:12 a.m. It had taken the team 47 minutes to suppress the blaze, and by then, the damage was irreversible. The basement, gone. First floor, charred skeleton. Second floor, collapsed. Through the ceiling like a house of soggy cards, Karen stood on the sidewalk barefoot, arms wrapped around her torso. She wasn't crying. Karen didn't cry, but her eyes red, dry, burning, held something new. Something ugly. Not regret. Resentment. She watched Lindsay give the final walkthrough with the fire crew, marking hotspots, checking for reignition risk. Karen turned to one of the board members who had come out in a robe and slippers, holding a coffee mug like a security blanket. This is what happens when we let unqualified people interfere in HOA business, Karen muttered. The board member blinked at her. Karen, she's a fire marshal. Karen narrowed her eyes. She made this personal. What Karen didn't realize, what she never even considered, was that everyone in Maple Glen was already watching the video. By 7 a.m., Toby's TikTok had passed 200,000 views. The caption had been updated. Karen, you can't enter without a permit. Fire. Bed. It had audio now, 2 edited clips of Karen yelling "Also," followed by a slow-motion zoom-in of Lindsay's stone-cold stare. The comment section was brutal. She really said no entry to the fire depth. She blocked emergency responders to save her ego. Ma'am, your cat just filed for emancipation. By 10 a.m., a local news van was parked outside the gates, and by noon, Karen's phone had over 47 missed calls from reporters, insurance reps, and one unfortunate nephew in Delaware who got looped into the drama because he once tagged her in a Facebook post about HOA gone wild. But it didn't stop there. An HOA member named Marlene Faulkner, soft-spoken and usually invisible at meetings, wrote a long post on Nextdoor. It read, "Last night, our community witnessed the consequence of pride over safety. As someone who voted to suppress Lindsay's fire report last month, I regret my silence. Karen made us believe it was about protecting the neighborhood, but we protected her power instead of our homes. That ends today." That post had 54 comments. Within 2 hours, most of them agreed. A few were angry. One simply said, "She almost burned the block down, and she still wants control." Lindsay, meanwhile, was back at the station. She didn't say much. She filed the report, debriefed her team, and went home to shower off the smoke. But as she stood under the hot water, her phone buzzed. An email. From the HOA vice president. Subject: emergency board meeting tonight, 6:30 p.m. Lindsay sighed. She already knew what it was about. That evening, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the community clubhouse, 9 board members sat around the long fox oak table. Karen at the head, tight-lipped, pale, daring anyone to cross her. But this time, the room wasn't on her side. Marlene sat opposite her. She cleared her throat. "I am moved to vote for temporary removal of Karen Whitmore as HOA president pending formal review." Karen didn't move. She didn't even blink. A second voice, old Mr. Darnell, muttered, "Seconded." Karen finally spoke. "This is a joke." Tiffany, the youngest board member, didn't smile. The only joke was ignoring a fire marshal's warning and endangering the entire neighborhood. Karen scoffed. "You're all traitors." No one replied, because the vote was already underway. The vote passed. 6 in favor, 3 abstained. No one voted against it, not even Karen. Not out loud. Anyway, for the first time in nearly a decade, she was officially removed as president of the Maple Glen HOA. Temporarily, the board said, pending formal review, they said. But everyone in the room knew what that really meant. Karen was done. She didn't storm out. She didn't scream. She simply stood, straightened her scarf, and walked out of the clubhouse without a word. Some said that was the scariest moment of all, because Karen didn't go down swinging. She just vanished. For 3 days, no one saw her. The wreckage of her house still smoked faintly, cordoned off by yellow caution tape and guarded at night by a hired security patrol because Karen, somehow, still had enough pull to keep people away. But the air in Maple Glen had shifted, and not just from the fire. Something didn't sit right with Lindsay. It wasn't just the fire itself, or Karen's shocking refusal to let them in. It was what had happened before that: the suppression of the fire report, the removal of the universal gate code, and the strange contradiction. Karen was obsessed with rules, but she broke every safety one in the book. And then there was the report, the one Lindsay had submitted 3 weeks before the fire. She hadn't seen it since. She asked Marlene. Marlene frowned. I remember voting, but I never saw the actual document. Tiffany added. Karen said it was in the archives, that the board reviewed it digitally. But when Lindsay requested a copy from the HOA's digital records, there was nothing. No file. No log. No digital footprint. It had been erased. And that was when Lindsay started to dig. On the morning of March 17th, a city inspector came by to assess the fire damage for municipal records. Routine. Nothing special. But when he walked through the charred basement, he noticed something strange behind a warped section of wall. A narrow space with a reinforced door, still partially intact. A hidden room. He called it in. And because the fire was classified as a hazard event with blocked first responder entry, Lindsay had jurisdiction to accompany him. She stepped into the soot-covered basement with a flashlight and ducked under a cracked support beam. The air was thick, damp, unsettled. The door to the hidden room was scorched but still locked. The inspector handed her a pry bar. It took 3 tries. When it finally swung open, Lindsay stared into a space she couldn't explain. Inside was a filing cabinet, untouched by flame, fire-resistant, black, industrial, still locked. Next to it, boxes, dozens, labeled with names, addresses, years, HOA member records, fines, letters, photos, some handwritten notes, and there on top of one pile was a folder marked Lindsay Myers. Inside were printouts of her application to the neighborhood, copies of her background check, even screenshots from her private social media. Notes in red ink. Potential influence risk. Remove credibility early. Watch son, loud skateboard. Hazard. Submit. Official complaint to board, February 11th. Lindsay felt the temperature in the room drop. Despite the soot still clinging to the walls, Karen hadn't just been running the HOA. She'd been running surveillance, collecting data, tracking dissent, preemptively targeting anyone who might challenge her authority. And now, that filing cabinet, likely filled with secrets on everyone in Maple Glen, was in Lindsay's hands. That night, Lindsay met with Marlene and Tiffany at her kitchen table. She laid out the photos she'd taken. This wasn't about a fire, or me, or even the HOA. Marlene whispered, this was about control. Tiffany nodded slowly. Karen built an empire. Marlene looked over the photos again. What do we do? Lindsay didn't hesitate. We take it to the neighborhood. The next Saturday morning, the clubhouse was standing room only. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 8:15, residents were already pouring in, murmuring, gripping coffee cups, exchanging looks that said everything and nothing at once. There was no bagels and juice table today. No chatter about yard contests or mailbox repainting. Everyone was here for one reason: Karen. She hadn't returned to Maple Glen since the night of the vote. Her scorched house sat like a tombstone at the end of Willowmere Drive, guarded, silent, and reeking of secrets. And Lindsay Myers had brought proof. She entered with a rolling cart, 3 boxes labeled Whitmore Records. Tiffany and Marlene followed close behind. When the meeting was called to order, Marlene stood at the front with a clipboard in hand, but she didn't need it. Her voice was steady. Her words were exact. There has been a serious breach of privacy and ethics in our neighborhood, she began. As of this week, a hidden storage room was discovered in the remains of Karen Whitmore's home, containing private documents, surveillance notes, and unauthorized files on at least 37 households in Maple Glen Estates. Gasps rippled across the room. Marlene opened one of the boxes and pulled out a folder. This one is for the DeLucas. Notes on their travel patterns. Complaints they never filed. Even internal arguments about their porch lights, none of which were ever shared with them. She pulled out another. This one labeled Henderson. Alice includes copies of emails marked deleted. How Karen accessed them, we still don't know. Lindsay stepped forward. This isn't just creepy, she said. It's illegal. These weren't just files for neighborhood rules, they were personal attacks, dossiers. She was building leverage on all of us, so no one would challenge her authority. Someone from the back yelled, "Is that why she shut down the petition?" Last year, another voice, "She fined me for a dog I don't even own." And then a third, "She tried to evict my cousin after a noise complaint from a house 2 doors down." The room was heating up now, and not just from the sunlight beaming through the blinds. Lindsay dropped the final folder onto the table, labeled in bold black letters, "Board corruption, hold for use." Inside were photocopies of HOA expense records, altered dates, duplicate invoices, and signatures that didn't match. Lindsay let it sit in the silence. Let the evidence speak for itself. Tiffany finally said what everyone was thinking. Karen wasn't just controlling us. She was cashing in. That's when Mr. Jennings stood up, quiet, usually invisible. Widower. Vietnam vet. "She fined me for planting a flagpole," he said. "Made me remove it after I buried my wife last spring. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, but now I see this whole place was a prison, and we were just inmates with lawnmowers." The room erupted. Not in chaos, not in shouting, in agreement. For the first time in years, neighbors looked at each other like human beings, not rule breakers, not citation risks. They saw a community, and they were furious. That afternoon, the board unanimously filed an official petition to pursue a permanent removal of Karen Whitmore from all HOA involvement. They also began the process to freeze her HOA payouts. Nearly $14,000 a year she'd been collecting under administrative stipends hidden in budget reports. Karen's empire was cracking. But she wasn't done yet. Because that night, just as the board posted the motion notice, on the Maple Glen website, a message appeared in the comments section. No name, no profile. Just this: "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you started." The post was short, 12 words, no name, no punctuation. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you started." Most people thought it was spam or a troll, just noise. But Lindsay, she knew better. That was Karen's voice. No insults, no rants. Just a threat in lowercase, like it didn't need to scream to land like a hammer. The board removed the comment. They blocked guest posts, disabled new accounts. But it was already too late. Because over the next 3 days, Maple Glen turned strange. At first, it was small things. The HOA printer jammed and began spewing old violation slips, thousands of them, old ones. Fines that had already been canceled, dating back nearly a decade, all with Karen's signature at the bottom. Lindsay's mailbox was ripped off its post overnight. Not smashed, not vandalized. Removed. Clean, quiet, surgical. Tiffany's Wi-Fi network was renamed HOA Traders at 2:17 a.m. one by one. Board members began reporting strange calls at odd hours. Silence on the line. Then a single word spoken. Softly, regret. And when Marlene opened her car door to drive to work, she found a single garden gnome on the front seat painted black. That's when it became clear Karen hadn't vanished. She'd gone underground. Someone had given her access to the HOA system. Someone inside, the files, the codes, the security database all had been manipulated in the last 72 hours. Lindsay tried to stay calm. She called the police. They offered a shrug and a clipboard. It's a civil matter, the officer said. We can't arrest someone for creepy messages unless there's a threat. It is a threat. Lindsay insisted. You just can't hear it unless you've lived through it. And then came the fire marshal report. Karen had filed an anonymous complaint alleging that Lindsay herself had violated emergency protocol by refusing to enter Karen's home the night of the fire. The irony was cruel. The report was full of contradictions, time stamps that didn't match, fabricated witness quotes. But it was enough to trigger an internal review. Lindsay was placed on temporary leave pending investigation. She didn't fight it. She didn't argue, because she knew something Karen didn't. The board had hired a forensic tech specialist. Someone from outside the neighborhood. Someone not in Karen's file cabinet. And what he found. That was the turning point. On the fourth day after the threat, the specialist Ryan, early 30s, flannel shirt, zero tolerance for nonsense, walked into Lindsay's kitchen with a thumb drive and said one word, found it. He plugged into her laptop and played a security feed Karen didn't know had backed up to the cloud. It was footage from her own basement, from 2 nights before the fire. Karen alone, pulling folders out of the cabinet, flipping through them. Then dragging a red gas can into the corner. She didn't pour it. She didn't light it. But she set it down next to the heater, on purpose, and looked straight into the camera, almost like she knew, like she wanted to be caught. Ryan hit pause. Look at the timestamp. Lindsay leaned in. It was 7 hours before the fire started. And now they had proof. Karen hadn't just ignored safety warnings. She had staged her own disaster. But why? And what else had she planned that no one had seen? The next morning, the board called for a full emergency HOA audit. Legal counsel was retained. Police were re-engaged. And for the first time, the authorities finally took interest. Not in the fire. In the intent behind it. Because now they weren't looking at an accident. They were looking at something else. Something worse. The investigation unfolded like a slow-burning fuse. The footage was undeniable. Karen Whitmore, the queen of Maple Glen Estates, had not only ignored fire safety, but had orchestrated the disaster that nearly destroyed her home and threatened an entire neighborhood. But why? Why would someone risk so much? The answer came from an unexpected place. A week after the footage surfaced, the board convened a town hall meeting. Lindsay stood at the podium, facing a packed room of residents, their faces a mix of anger, confusion, and betrayal. She cleared her throat and began. Karen's actions weren't just about control. They were about desperation. Lindsay explained what she'd discovered digging deeper into Karen's finances: massive debt, loans taken out in secret, unpaid fines that would have bankrupted most homeowners, and an insurance policy on the house, recently increased to a value far beyond market price, she was planning to collect. Lindsay said quietly. Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's fire wasn't an accident. It was arson for profit. But that wasn't the end. Behind the scenes, During the investigation, a new discovery emerged. In Karen's files hidden deep in that burned basement were documents revealing a decades-old secret about Maple Glen Estates itself. The neighborhood was built on land once owned by a family that vanished under mysterious CIRCUMSTANCESA cover-up had buried those records. Karen had found the truth and used it as leverage blackmail, bribery, threats to keep the HOA firmly in her grip. She'd controlled more than bylaws and fines. She'd controlled secrets. The revelations rocked the community to its core. But Maple Glen wasn't broken dot, it was waking up. Neighbors who'd been divided for years came together to elect new leadership transparent, accountable, and open. Marlene Faulkner was chosen as the new HOA president. Lindsay was invited to lead the newly formed Safety and Transparency Committee. As for Karen Whitmore, she disappeared from Maple Glen Estates for good. Her scorched house was eventually demolished, but the memory of her reign of how one woman's thirst for control nearly burned down a whole neighborhood lingered like smoke on the wind. Final call to action closing the story. This story isn't just about fire. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked, when secrets rule over community, and how ordinary people can fight back. If you've ever felt powerless against an HOA, remember change starts with standing up. Like, subscribe, and share this story to keep the conversation alive. Because every neighborhood deserves to be more than just rules and finds they deserve respect, transparency, and a voice. Thanks for watching Maple Glen's story. Stay safe out there.